Thank you for inviting me. Okay, I will. The talk is based on my recent book that is, you can see the front page here in the screen. And the picture is a picture that has been done by my sister. I'm from Colombia. I live in England, and I'm also a British citizen, but I was born in Colombia. And my sister is an artist, and she did a project that was with a group of fishermen in the north coast of Colombia, in the Caribbean coast. And the project, she was investigating issues on sustainability and communities. And then she decided to do an artistic project that was inviting the fishermen in a particular beach to collect all the garbage from the beach and to create an artistic way of exhibiting these arts. So they together started doing the collection, and then they decided to hang all the plastic bottles and objects from the tree. And it was a fascinating experience because they, by doing that, they not only develop a little bit more of environmental consciousness, but also develop a lot of links and had a lot of fun together doing it. And this became like an artifact of community arts and community projects for sustainability. So that's the idea. When I did the book, this book is based in previous work that I've been doing with John, my husband, who is also here and will be talking next month. And we've been trying to clarify the way that Stafford Beer's theory can be applied in the current context to not only to design organizations that are more viable, but that are more viable and more sustainable. And what I'm going to tell you is precisely like summary of how do we understand viability and sustainability, how do we understand the idea of governance, and in particular self-governance, and how do we consider that this could be applied and has been applied to develop organizations, communities, and nations that are more viable and more sustainable. So that's the purpose of the talk. I also talk about seeing the viable system model as an emancipatory approach, because I consider that the original thinking from Stafford Beer was a very revolutionary thinking that was to understand that in any level, in an organization, in a community, in a cooperative, in a nation, if we think cybernetically, and we try to see organizations as viable systems, we will develop a way of understanding organizations that is focusing on people and giving people the opportunity to participate and have their views, political views, on the development of the organization or the community or the region or the nation in a much more emancipatory way. And this is something that not many people have understood. I'm going to go through that. There has been historical criticisms of the VSM that, in my views, have been misunderstandings or lack of understanding of the fundamental theory. So in this talk, I'm going to explain to you how do I see the VSM for understanding self-governance in complex societies, and how I think that it can support the transition towards a post-capitalistic economy. And I'm going to give you some examples. First, I'm going to reflect a bit in the Cybersyn project in Chile that was Stafford Beer's more famous project, and that has been, again, many times misrepresented and criticized from people that I don't think that have understood completely the theory. And I'm going to show you some examples of applications of the VSM that I had the opportunity to do in the 1990s in Colombia at the national level. And then later on in the last decade, applying VSM in communities, both in Colombia and in Europe. And I want to demonstrate from my own perspective what I think that are the challenges of putting the VSM into practice as an emancipatory approach, and how this way of understanding the theory can really help us to make a transition to a post-capitalistic society. So if we think why self-governance is what is a post-capitalistic society and why self-governance is critical, first of all, given that the world and our societies are facing multiple crises, I think that no one of us have any doubt about it, especially in this geopolitical moment we are living. Most of the indicators suggest we are moving in the wrong direction, not towards sustainability, but towards less sustainability. And the hypothesis that we have is that a prerequisite for changing the direction is that we need new approach to understand the way we can organize ourselves. We need to shift to a post-capitalistic society to ensure that everyone is provided with the basics for a fulfilling life and our devastated ecosystems can be regenerated. And we can self-govern ourselves and our institutions to encourage massive systemic change. This change from the current society to a post-capitalistic society requires what I call a massive systemic change, a change in our way of thinking, a change in our way of organizing, a change in our way of participating. And I consider that the BSM offers lots of insights on how to make this shift. The main problem is this paradigm that we are based on economic growth, the capitalistic idea of economic growth, like continuous growth, that is an idea that is completely against the ideas of sustainability. So we have many critics like Thomas Piketty, George Monbiot, that critique the idea of neoliberal growth. And they demonstrate that it is just taking us to escalating socio-ecological crisis, rising inequality and ecological degradation, and governance misaligned with planetary boundaries. So it's clear that we need for a systemic redesign of governance to shift from an extractive to a regenerative logic. And this implies as well shifting from sustainable development to regeneration. No, the idea of sustainable development as meeting the present needs without compromising the future generations needs to be aligned with the economic model. The underlying economic model that is happening everywhere in the majority of the countries around the world is conducive to what we call weak sustainability policies and practice. So we have the ideas, we have the sustainable development goals. We've been for decades trying to progress towards sustainability, but most of the things that we are doing are not strong enough, are not effective enough, and we are not really heading towards a change towards more sustainability, but on the contrary, we are still in the old paradigm and the situation is only getting worse. So how do we produce this shift from extractive to regenerative logic is the main question that we have. As you know, well, some of you may know Stafford Beer was a pioneer cybernetician who invented management cybernetics, nowadays called more organizational cybernetics. He passed away in 2002 after having been a very famous professor on cybernetics and having led very interesting experiments at different levels. The most famous one being the Cybersyn project that was in Chile in 1971 and 1973. Stafford's idea, the main invention, the bubble system model, he explained that a bubble system is an organization that is capable of independent existence. And to be capable of independent existence, it needs to be self-organized, self-regulated, hierarchical rather than hierarchical, co-evolving within each, and agile. So being able to identify situations, change according to the situations, produce responses in an agile way that guarantee that it can remain being viable. It meaning being able to do what it does. The inspiration of the BSM came from understanding the neurological model of the brain and how the brain interacts with the different physiological organs of the body, and how it does happen in a completely hierarchical way, rather than the idea that the brain is like the top and the body is like the organs are like subjected to decisions in the brain. The reality is that in the body, everything is like a neural network that is hierarchical, not hierarchical, and each one of the organs have like their own little brains and intelligence, and the way that they interact is like a very effective, completely flat neural network. These ideas were inspired Stafford to see how can we create organizations that operate like a neural network in a hierarchical and not hierarchical way, where the ideas of self-organization, self-regulation, co-evolution, and agility are the ideas that are in the bottom of the principles of organization. John and me have been trying to clarify the ideas of the viable system model and clarify what does it mean to be not only viable, but viable and sustainable. Because in the current context, we don't want organizations that are viable and that can be really damaging the environment, damaging the communities where they live, no, not contributing to an economy that is more regenerative than capitalistic. So in that respect, in our previous book that John will be talking more about very likely next time, and in my recent book, we explain this idea of a viable and sustainable organization. And we say a viable and sustainable organization is one that co-evolves with the socio-ecological niche, preserves ecological patrimony, develops regenerative capacity, and embeds sustainability into governance. So it's not only being able to be viable financially, meaning being able to continue doing what it does, but being able to do it in a way that is not affecting negatively the environment, both the social and the ecological environment where it operates. The work that we have been doing is trying to clarify some of the main components of the viable system. I'm not going to go into detail into what is the theory. Maybe John next time will go deeper into explaining the theory. I'm going to just give you an overview. But the basic principles of the theory, Stafford talks about systems 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And he says systems 1 are the operational systems. They are the ones that are in direct contact with the environment. They are the ones responsible for doing the main tasks of the organization. And the main characteristics of systems 1 are that they are autonomous, they are self-organizing. Each one of the systems 1 will be capable of making their own decisions, respecting the whole ethos and the whole resources and constraints and the rules of the game that are shared by the whole group of viable organizations that interact as a whole. Each one of them they should be agile in their management. Each one of them should have sustainable interactions with the relevant ecosystems that they interact with. And that's the idea of the systems 1. Very autonomous, agile, sustainable, interacting sort of sub-organizations. And then in order to keep all these organizations coherent, we need to have very clear rules of the game. Yeah, clear and transparent rules of the game. Stafford talks about system 2, like the way of harmonizing the interactions between the system 2. And part of the criteria is to have distributed control and leaderships between the systems 1 and clear, transparent rules of the game. System 3 is the one that produces the synergies between the system 1, and different than other traditional management models. What Stafford suggests is that system 3 should be distributed. So the idea of control is not control, it's distributed control. It's not leadership, like one leader that is deciding on behalf of the systems 1. Is a leadership that is distributed amongst the systems 1. So each one of the systems 1 will have their operational management, and these operational managers will be very proactively involved in determining the overall decisions, management decisions of the whole of the system of an organizational unit or organization as a whole. So this idea of distributed control of and leadership is fundamental. And then system 4 will be the one responsible for innovation and adaptation, for scanning and learning. And altogether, system 3 and system 4 and system 5 will be interacting in a way conducive to develop sustainable self-governance, the capability of being self-governed, at every level of organization. And System 5 is the one that provides identity, closure, ethos, and policy. And also, it is the one responsible for facilitating a context for the emergence of collective consciousness. Yeah, so these are like the basic principles that we have been distilling from the BSM to clarify how can we understand the idea of sustainable self-governance in an organization that we consider that is like the basis for progressing towards a more post-capitalistic economy and society. These principles are recursive. Recursive means that the same principles apply at any level of embedded organizations. All the organizations have sub-organizations that are embedded. So we can think from the globe, from the planet, the different regions, the different continents, the different countries, different nations, and within the nations, the different ecoregions and the different communities and industries, and within the industries, the different businesses, and so on. And each one of these levels of organization have different levels of complexity, and each one of them is embedded within each other. And the idea of the BSM is that we can apply the same principles of viability and sustainability to each one of these embedded level of organizations. So we say that enabling sustainable governance includes developing a parallel bottom-up strategy that nurtures self-consciousness and change at all levels. It enables distributed governance that requires effective decision-making at each level of recursion. And we consider that it is in these decision-making spaces that collective consciousness may emerge. So the idea behind this way of looking at the BSM is that if we could develop from the very bottom up, from the very teams of people that are doing particular works in a particular organization, if we could develop these similar principles of responsibility and ethical behavior and responsibility with the environment and collective learning and collective self-governance, then it is more likely that some kinds of social consciousness will be emerging at this level, and by the end, that could replicate and could have an impact at higher levels of organization. The way that I have practiced the application of the BSM, because I've always loved these theories, but I've always loved putting them into practice and learning from practice and challenging the theories based on practice, is through this that I call the self-transformation methodology. That is basically a learning methodology, a methodology to facilitate learning between groups of people that want to apply the BSM in particular context, types of organization or whatever. Yeah, and basically what it does is facilitate a cycle of diagnosing the organization, redesigning the organization, implementing changes, monitoring and reflecting about the way that these changes have improved organizational performance and organizational cohesion. The way that I see this methodology is basically giving people the opportunity to be the ones who redesign their organizations, the ones who decide what needs to change, the ones to propose the changes. So the way that we do it is that the consultant or the facilitator is a person that goes there and will be will be developing a participatory, emancipatory learning process. Why emancipatory? Because if the workers are the people that are observing the problems that they have, using the BSM as a mental model that will help them to structure their observations and structure their learning, then it will be, they are the only ones that have what Stafford Beer called requisite variety. Yeah? Requisite variety is the capability of dealing with particular kind of situations. So they have requisite variety. When we do this learning process collectively, then governance becomes distributed. There is more possibility of developing autonomy, giving them autonomy and keeping cohesion. And we can facilitate the group process of learning as systemic adaptation. So this is like the philosophy, the idea behind the methodology that I use in practical terms to put into practice this understanding of the BSM. If we go to the history of applications of the BSM, I'm pretty sure that most of you have heard about the Cybersyn project in Chile. This is a picture of Stafford, the top of the table, during one of the meetings with the leaders of the Cybersyn project. It's 1971, 1972. 1973 really, Allende was elected as the first socialist president in South America. That was after Fidel Castro was in Cuba. That was extremely exciting, and Salvador Allende managed to get a group of people with him working on the idea of how to create a completely democratic socialist society. And Fernando Flores, who was one of the leaders of the group, invited the Stafford Beer. He was also into cybernetics, invited Stafford Beer to be part of the team. And Stafford led this Cybersyn project during the time that they have, that it was only 2 years. And until the coup that the CIA promoted to derrocate Salvador Allende's government, and Allende died, and the whole cybernetic project and the whole socialist project collapsed. But the Cybersyn project remained in the mind of the people as one of the most revolutionary and advanced attempts of put cybernetics in the hands of the workers, and to create with a cybernetic model of management that was supposed to be helping to devolve the power to workers. The ideal of the project was to regulate the economy, the Chilean economy, in real time, but they had very antiquated equipment. In those days, the computers were very primitive. There was no internet. They only have like telex machines to simulate the idea of the internet. They didn't have foreign reserves to buy new equipment, but they used managerial cybernetics and the VSM as an inspiration to develop the whole thing. And the idea was that all systems will be based on participation and working control. Obviously, that was very challenging. It was an enormously big project. They were focusing on the industrial economy. In that moment, Allende has already nationalized a big number of the Chilean industries, and it had the bold control to the workers to manage the nationalized industries. So it was the perfect setting to try to experiment with these democratic ideas of governance. Yeah. The idea was to apply the VSM at different levels of recursion or different levels of organization, at the level of the whole nation, understanding the government, the economy, the industry, each one of the branches of the nationalized industries, each one of the sectors, each one of the lines within the sector, each one of the companies working in that line, each one of the departments, each one of the workshops, down to the crews and the workers themselves. So very ambitious project, and obviously that will need a lot of education and understanding, re-education and understanding of what does it mean to work in an organization, and how could we devolve control from the top to the lower level. The idea was to pioneer a distributed governance companies versus government. The ideal was to create this information that was transmitted once a day by the companies. They design about 10 key performance indicators for each business, and they were processed by a team of engineers and sent to the operations room. The idea of the operations room was a room in the Palace of La Moneda in Santiago de Chile, where they have this very preliminary technology, but the idea was that all the president and the ministers will be sitting down there, and they will be receiving information from each one of the factories, and they will be able to identify when there was something that was completely out of control, and they will be able to produce like algedonics and emergency measures to support the independent factories and each one of the levels of the industry to retake control. So that was the idea. And simultaneously, they have this idea that for me was one of the most beautiful and powerful inventions in the Cybersyn project, that was called the People Project. And the idea was how to create a technology that will allow the president to communicate with the people, to understand the feelings and the emotions of the people, and the reactions about the policies and the strategies and the projects that the government was doing. So Allende used to go to the TV. In those days, they invented a very ingenious mechanism that was through the TV antennas. They invented what they call an algedonic meter, in which people could like a happy face in which people could say if they were how happy or unhappy they were with whatever the government was suggesting or doing. And that information was transmitted to the TV antennas and was collected in the Cybersyn project to give in real time, sort of similar to real time, an impression, a response from the people, a communication from the people's feelings to the government. So really, really, really a pioneering idea that was not fully implemented, of course, because of the constraints of the technology, but that was very unique and still has had enormous applications. I mean, if you see what we see, the happy faces that we see nowadays in the train stations and the shops and the toilets and everywhere, this idea of the happy faces was originally Stafford's idea of the algedonic meters. So after this experience that I'm pretty sure that you can find a lot of information and emails and documentaries and there is still exhibitions about what was the Cybersyn project and the operations room that happened in 1990 in 2023 on the 50-year anniversary in Chile, and then was reproduced in Barcelona in September last year, and is coming to Frankfurt in November this year. So lots of people are still doing remembrances of the Cybersyn project. When I was doing my PhD in Aston University by the end of the 1980s, I met Stafford Beer, and I became very close friend of him. I was lucky enough to have been one of the, perhaps the only Latin American student that was, the PhD student that was learning about the BSM. And then before I finished my PhD, I went back to Colombia, and I ended up working with the Colombian president's office because they were looking for someone. They were in touch with the Chileans, and they were trying to create a cybernetic project in the president's office in Colombia in those days, in the 1990s. So I had the opportunity to work in 3 or 4 projects in this quatriennium that are the ones that I'm going to tell you about, that were for a big opportunity, a big inspiration for me. All of them inspired, of course, in what Stafford had been trying to do in Chile. One of the projects was developing more environmental governance in Colombia. That project lasted nearly 5 years, and the idea was to use the bubble system model in the National Environmental Network. And what we did was, for about a year, I had representatives of the different environmental agencies doing BSM workshops and rethinking how to represent the nation as a bubble system. And we ended up thinking the best way to do it is to identify ecoregions and to try to see what are the best way of co-managing each one of the ecoregions by not following the political and administrative roles like the environmental agencies, the political agencies of each one of the municipalities, by creating a kind of meta-systemic management using BSM language, of each one of the ecoregions. What did we manage to do that? By doing that, we managed a stronger regional governance, share knowledge about the different ecoregions, and a much more collaborative environmental management. We managed that people will be focusing on where were the main strategic goals of environmental goals and strategic challenges of each one of the ecoregions. We managed people to share budgets, to share ways of measuring environmental indicators, ways of making decisions at the local level in a more collaborative way. We used the BSM. In the left-hand side, you see look what it will be like, the recursive mapping of the nation with the different ecoregions and the communities and industries in each one of the ecoregions. And in the right-hand side, you see a model that will just like an inspiration of how would that translate if we put it in BSM language. What are the kind of things that we'll be analyzing, and what we do basically is to identify the different kind of systems 1, systems 2, 3, 4, 5, and try to focus on the governance mechanisms and the relationship between the different levels of organization with the environment, and try to engineer that collectively with the people that work in the Ministry of Environment and the national environmental sector, taking into account their points of view. So it was a fantastic, beautiful learning experience. And I learned in that experience how easy was for these environmentalists to understand the theory and the language. And I understood because there is a lot of resemblance between systemic thinking and cybernetic thinking and ecological thinking. So in a way, it was a very interesting revelation for me to see how these paradigms fit together very nicely, and most of the people I was working were not scared of the apparent technocratic language of the model, because obviously when Stafford first developed the VSM, it was very much inspired in in neurophysiology, but also with a lot of ideas from neural networks and electronics and things like that. We did as well at the same time the Gorgonas integration um, that was in 1996. That was another methodology that Stafford invented to generate a dialogue between a large group of people with complete democratic and egalitarian participation from everyone. And we did as integration in an island, in the Gorgona Island, in the Colombian Pacific. And it was a fantastic experience. And we managed with representatives from the government, from academia, from indigenous communities, from Black Americans communities, and so on. We managed to create a kind of overview of the environmental organization. Another project that was also fascinating was in 1994, 1998. There was a national project, the national program led by the President's Office to fight poverty in Colombia, and it was financed by the Inter-American Development Bank and the President's Office. And they asked me to lead the project to design an alternative way of monitoring the impact of this program in the poor populations where it was implemented. So we created, inspiring the Cybersyn project as well, we created a network of 8 universities with 40 researchers and 140 students who were going to live in these towns, the poorest towns in the country, and they will be educating the local people about the ideas of development. We were very inspired in McNiff's ideas of human skill development, and the implication for measuring poverty, not just as a lack of financial resources, but lack of social resources and ecological resources. And then the students operated in a sample of the poorest municipalities in the country, and we educated the community to become more active citizens. And then they started collecting indicators and producing collectively algedonic signals, like the idea of there is something that is supposed to be going in that direction, is not going in that direction, what is going on, and creating real-time mechanisms, participatory mechanisms for affecting the way that these programs were implemented, involving people in the locality. It was inspired in the VSM and in the Beer's ideas of early alarm systems. It created a very unique experience of participatory budgeting about pre and post investment. It involved a lot of decisions on required local investment to fight poverty. We gave the opportunity to people to decide where to allocate the money. We created a context for participatory decisions and agreement of budgets and projects at each level of organization. And we created the system, the technology, to generate these early alarms for implementations on the projects to fight poverty. It was a fantastic project. We learned that the VSM can be used to support and design implementation and complex development projects. Most of the town mayors reported very positive effects on elevation on democratic governance. We have a much wider involvement of stakeholders for co-designing development projects and a legacy of citizen-led development. And we shift the emphasis from short-term efficient investment of resources to development of long-term potentials of each one of the municipalities. Another project that we did was redesigning the school system. We created what was called the new school system, or an educational reform in Colombia. It was in the Ministry of Education, also in the 1990s. It aimed to reform the whole educational system, the school system in Colombia. And the idea was to design a systemic school system to address gaps in coverage and quality of basic education. We promoted the idea of autonomous complete schools that have more control over resources and more responsibility for the educational results. And we try to empower the schools to manage their operations more effectively. We supported local and regional institutions in self-transformation programs and monitoring. Again, we use the language of the VSM and the methodology that I have mentioned before in creating the national school system and redesigning the national school system. And we managed to create more participatory approaches for systemic change, to engage stakeholders, to strengthen collaboration. We did some prototypes and managed to facilitate community mobilization and improve the school governance. Then in the last few decades, when I moved to England, that was in 2002, I started working with John in trying to apply these ideas at the level of communities. The first project we did together was in Ireland, in an eco-village in Clough Jordan. We started like sort of foreseeing what is a viable and sustainable community. And the idea, well, a community where you can hopefully working from home, walking or biking to work, producing your own food, recycling, reforesting, using renewable energy, having loving and caring family members, plants and animals. And this community in Clough Jordan in Ireland had this idea. They have bought some land and they developed the most fantastic project. And they called John, because John had a lot of experience in cooperatives. They were a cooperative. John invited me, and for 3 years we accompanied them to apply the VSM and to improve their organization. Yeah. They had a lot of challenges, and we managed to clarify like the different way of organizing the operational task, create a better metasystemic management, and strengthen the cooperative governance. It was absolutely fascinating. And then the same idea I applied in Colombia with one of my students, Carolina Duque. She's an anthropologist, and she had been working in the Amazonas jungle, in the Colombian Amazonas jungle, in particular with this tribe called they call themselves the Yurupari Jaguars, and it's in the Pirá-Paraná River in the Amazon. The goals of this intervention was to preserve ancestral ecological knowledge and to strengthen the engagement of these particular indigenous with the state governance, with the Colombian state governance. It was a fascinating experiment to try to understand the way they govern themselves, the way they have organized themselves to do the different economic activities they do of producing food, hunting, taking care of the environment, education, housing, and so on, and how we managed to interpret the way that they do it with the VSM. The result was they did work with us, and they reinforced what they call the mingas, the collaborative work. They strengthened the indigenous councils, and they improved the representation capacity to interact with the regional government, the Colombian government. So again, a 1-year project, really, really fascinating. Then another experience with another of my students that was in Rosario Islands. This is the Colombian Caribbean. And this is one of the most, it's an ecological reserve. This a marine ecological reserve, extremely beautiful. And the inhabitants are Afro-Caribbean descendants who have been living in these islands, and they do live from things like ecotourism and restaurants and hotels and craft businesses and so on, basically all related with ecotourism. So we helped them again. Well, Carlos did it as part of his dissertation, and I supported him to understand the different community groups that were responsible for ecotourism, well-being, earth care, land use, security and justice, and to represent the way of strengthening their governance through interpreting them through the VSM in very participatory workshops with the community. This again was a very interesting and beautiful project. The last one was another project with another of my PhD students in a local town called Girón, that is in northeast Colombia, close to Venezuela. This is one of the places that most affected by poverty, with a very mixed up community that includes ex-narco-traffickers, ex-guerrilla groups, ex-paramilitaries, no, people from all sorts of backgrounds, but really violent, poor community. And Andrea managed to create a project that was to develop, to support them to fight poverty as a community. And it was very beautiful because it was how to help them to develop regional innovation using as well the BSM as a sort of framework in the background to understand their community organizations. The outcomes after several years of work was in the endogenous development initiatives, strengthened collective development capabilities, innovation capabilities, learning capabilities, and developing the community meta system. That is the way that we refer to their governance structure. Yeah. In all these experiences, the learning that I have had is to see the shift from an authoritarian model of organization to a model of organization based on autonomy, shifting from hierarchy to collaborative networks, from profit-only metrics to multi-capital metrics, from control to distributed self-governance, from extraction to regeneration. In general, I see the BSM and Teams Integrity like an alternative to for bottom-up approaches to governance, self-organizing autonomous operational units, individuals' flair and creativity unleashed, egalitarian learning context when people can achieve the maximum development of their potential, have an equal chance of articulating their concerns, are organized to democratically and creatively decide ways forward. And in conclusion, what I see is that to go towards sustainable development, it requires recursive viable systems, an embedded sustainability ethos, distributed leadership, new performance metrics, and collective learning. And I consider that the BSM and the self-transformation methodology offer a coherent theory, a participatory methodology, and cross-scale applicability. And if used as an emancipatory approach, it can promote sustainable self-governance and help in the transition to a post-capitalistic economy. So this is it from me. I'll leave you there some references. And in Metaforum, that is the cooperative that John and me lead that is developing Stafford Beer legacy, you can see a lot of resources on the BSM, bibliography, books, webinars. We have a YouTube channel, no? And here I leave you some links. This is the centenary of Stafford Beer project that we are organizing. And this is an invitation for our conference this year in September in Manchester, where we'll be sharing and, among others, all these topics on development and governance. So that's all for me, and I'm very happy to engage with any questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you very much, Angela. That was really excellent.